to by all parties, to take any share in this discussion, more especially because I wish to preserve the best understanding and the clearest relations with Mr. Henry Gowan. I have very strong reasons indeed for entertaining that wish. Mrs. Gowan attributed certain views of furthering the marriage to my friend here in conversation with me before it took place, and I endeavoured to undeceive her. I represented that I knew him, as I did and do, to be strenuously opposed to it, both in opinion and action. "You see," said Mrs. Gowan, turning the palms of her hands towards Mr. Meagles, as if she were justice herself, representing to him that he had better confess, for he had not a leg to stand on. "You see, very good. Now, Papa and Mamma Meagles both," here she rose, "allow me to take the liberty of putting an end to this rather formidable controversy. I will not say another word upon its merits. I will only say that it is an additional proof of what one knows from all experience, that this kind of thing never answers, as my poor fellow himself would say, that it never pays, in one word, that it never does." Mr. Meagles asked, "What kind of thing?" "It is in vain," said Mrs. Gowan, "for people to attempt to get on together who have such extremely different antecedents, who are jumbled against each other in this accidental matrimonial sort of way, and who cannot look at the untoward circumstance which has shaken them together in the same light. It never does." Mr. Meagles was beginning, "Permit me to say, ma'am—" "No, don't," returned Mrs. Gowan. "Why should you? It is an ascertained fact. It never does. I will therefore, if you please, go my way, leaving you to yours. I shall at all times be happy to receive my good fellow's pretty wife, and I shall always make a point of being on the most affectionate terms with her. But as to these terms, semi-family and semi-stranger, semi-goring and semi-boring, they form a state of things quite amusing in its impracticability. I assure you it never does." The dowager here made a smiling obeisance rather to the room than to anyone in it, and therewith took a final farewell of Papa and Mamma Meagles. Clennam stepped forward to hand her to the pill-box which was at the service of all the pills in Hampton Court Palace, and she got into that vehicle with distinguished serenity and was driven away. Thenceforth, the dowager, with a light and careless humour, often recounted to her particular acquaintance how, after a hard trial, she had found it impossible to know those people who belonged to Henry's wife, and who had made that desperate set to catch him. Whether she had come to the conclusion beforehand that to get rid of them would give her favourite pretence a better air, might save her some occasional inconvenience, and could risk no less, the pretty creature being fast married and her father devoted to her, was best known to herself. Though this history has its opinion on that point too, and decidedly in the affirmative. Chapter 9. Appearance and Disappearance. "Arthur, my dear boy," said Mr. Meagles on the evening of the following day, "Mother and I have been talking this over, and we don't feel comfortable in remaining as we are. That elegant connection of ours, that dear lady who was here yesterday—" "I understand," said Arthur. "Even that affable and condescending ornament of society," pursued Mr. Meagles, "may misrepresent us, we are afraid. We could bear a great deal, Arthur, for her sake, but we think we would rather not bear that, if it was all the same to her." "Good," said Arthur. "Go on." "You see," proceeded Mr. Meagles, "it might put us wrong with our son-in-law, it might even put us wrong with our daughter, and it might lead to a great deal of domestic trouble. You see, don't you?" "Yes, indeed," returned Arthur. "There is much reason in what you say." He had glanced at Mrs. Meagles, who was always on the good and sensible side, and a petition had shone out of her honest face that he would support Mr. Meagles in his present inclinings. "So we are very much disposed, Mother and I," said Mr. Meagles, "to pack up our bags and baggage and go among the Allongers and Marchongers once more. I mean, we are very much disposed to be off, strike right through France into Italy, and see our pet." "And I don't think," replied Arthur, touched by the motherly anticipation in the bright face of Mrs. Meagles. She must have been very like her daughter once. That you could do better, and if you ask me for my advice, is that you set off tomorrow. Is it really, though? Said Mr. Meagles. Mother, this is being backed in an idea. Mother, with a look which thanked Clennam in a manner very agreeable to him, answered that it was indeed. The fact is, besides, Arthur, said Mr. Meagles, the old cloud coming over his face, that my son-in-law is already in debt again, and that I suppose I must clear him again. It may be as well, even on this account, that I should step over there and look him up in a friendly way. Then again, here's mother foolishly anxious, and yet naturally too, about Pet's state of health, and that she should not be left to feel lonesome at the present time. It's undeniably a long way off, Arthur, and a strange place for the poor love under all the circumstances. Let her be as well cared for as any lady in that land, still it is a long way off. Just as home is home, though it's never so homely, why you see, said Mr. Meagles, adding a new version to the proverb, Rome is Rome, though it's never so Romely. All perfectly true, observed Arthur, and all sufficient reasons for going. I'm glad you think so. It decides me. Mother, my dear, you may get ready. We have lost our pleasant interpreter. She spoke 3 foreign languages beautifully, Arthur. You have heard her many a time, and you must pull me through it, Mother, as well as you can. I require a deal of pulling through, Arthur, said Mr. Meagles, shaking his head. A deal of pulling through. I stick at everything beyond noun substantive, and I stick at him, if he's at all a tight one. Now I think of it, returned Clennam, there's Cavaletto. He shall go with you if you like. I could not afford to lose him, but you will bring him safe back. Well, I am very much obliged to you, my boy, said Mr. Meagles, turning it over, but I think not. No, I think I'll be pulled through by mother. Cavaliero, I stick at his very name to start with, and it sounds like the chorus to a comic song, is so necessary to youth that I don't like the thought of taking him away. More than that, there's no saying when we may come home again, and it would never do to take him away for an indefinite time. The cottage is not what it was. It only holds 2 little people less than it ever did, Pet and her poor unfortunate maid, Tattycoram, but it seems empty now. Once out of it, there's no knowing when we may come back to it. No, Arthur, I'll be pulled through by mother. They would do best by themselves, perhaps, after all, Clennam thought, therefore did not press his proposal. If you would like to come down and stay here for a change, when it wouldn't trouble you, Mr. Meagles resumed, I should be glad to think of it, and so would mother too, I know, that you were brightening up the old place with a bit of life it was used to when it was full, and that the babies on the wall there had a kind eye upon them sometimes. You so belong to the spot and to them, Arthur, and we should every one of us have been so happy if it had fallen out. But let us see, how's the weather for travelling now? Mr. Meagles broke off, cleared his throat, and got up to look out of the window. They agreed that the weather was of high promise, and Clennam kept the talk in that safe direction until it had become easy again, when he gently diverted it to Henry Gowan and his quick sense and agreeable qualities when he was delicately dealt with. He likewise dwelt on the indisputable affection he entertained from his wife. Clennam did not fail of his effect upon good Mr. Meagles, whom these commendations greatly cheered, and who took mother to witness that the single and cordial desire of his heart in reference to their daughter's husband was harmoniously to exchange friendship for friendship and confidence for confidence. Within a few hours the cottage furniture began to be wrapped up for preservation in the family absence, or, as Mr. Meagles expressed it, the house began to put its hair in papers, and within a few days father and mother were gone. Mrs. Tickett and Dr. Buchan were posted, as of yore, behind the parlour blind, and Arthur's solitary feet were rustling among the dry fallen leaves in the garden walks. As he had a liking for the spot, he seldom let a week pass without paying a visit. Sometimes he went down alone from Saturday to Monday. Sometimes his partner accompanied him. Sometimes he merely strolled for an hour or 2 about the house and garden, saw that all was right, and returned to London again. At all times and under all circumstances, Mrs. Tickett, with her dark row of curls, and Dr. Buchan, sat in the parlour window, looking out for the family return. On one of his visits, Mrs. Tickit received him with the words, "I have something to tell you, Mr. Clennam, that will surprise you." So surprising was the something in question that it actually brought Mrs. Tickit out of the parlour window and produced her in the garden walk when Clennam went in at the gate on its being opened for him. "What is it, Mrs. Tickit?" said he. "Sir," returned that faithful housekeeper, having taken him into the parlour and closed the door, "if ever I saw the led-away and deluded child in my life, I saw her identically in the dusk of yesterday evening." "You don't mean Tatty Coram?" "Yes, I do," quoth Mrs. Tickit, clearing the disclosure at a leap. "Where?" "Mr. Clennam," returned Mrs. Tickit, "I was a little heavy in my eyes, being that I was waiting longer than customary for my cup of tea, which was then preparing by Mary Jane. I was not sleeping, nor what a person would term correctly dozing. I was more what a person would strictly call watching with my eyes closed." Without entering upon an inquiry into this curious abnormal condition, Clennam said, "Exactly. Well?" "Well, sir," proceeded Mrs. Tickit, "I was thinking of one thing and thinking of another, just as you yourself might, just as anybody might." "Precisely so," said Clennam. "Well?" "And when I do think of one thing and do think of another," pursued Mrs. Tickit, "I hardly need to tell you, Mr. Clennam, that I think of the family, because, dear me, a person's thoughts—" Mrs. Tickit said this with an argumentative and philosophic air. "However they may stray, will go more or less on what is uppermost in their minds. They will do it, sir, and a person can't prevent them." Arthur subscribed to this discovery with a nod. "You find it so yourself, sir, I'll be bold to say," said Mrs. Tickit, "and we all find it so. It ain't our stations in life that changes us, Mr. Clennam. Thoughts is free. As I was saying, I was thinking of one thing and thinking of another, and thinking very much of the family. Not of the family in the present times only, but in the past times too. For when a person does begin thinking of one thing and thinking of another in that manner, as it's getting dark, what I say is, that all times seem to be present, and a person must get out of that state and consider before they can say which is which." He nodded again, afraid to utter a word lest it should present any new opening to Mrs. Tickit's conversational powers. "In consequence of which," said Mrs. Tickit, "when I quivered my eyes and saw her actual form and looking in at the gate, I let them close again without so much as starting, for that actual form and figure came so pat to the time when it belonged to the house as much as mine or your own, that I never thought at the moment of its having gone away. But, sir, when I quivered my eyes again and saw it wasn't there, then it all flooded upon me with a fright, and I jumped up." "You ran out directly?" said Clennam. "I ran out," assented Mrs. Tickit, "as fast as ever my feet would carry me, and if you'll credit it, Mr. Clennam, there wasn't in the whole shining heavens, no, not so much as a finger of that young woman." Passing over the absence from the firmament of this novel constellation, Arthur inquired of Mrs. Tickit if she herself went beyond the gate. "Went to and fro, and high and low," said Mrs. Tickit, "and saw no sign of her." He then asked Mrs. Tickit how long a space of time she supposed there might have been between the two sets of ocular quiverings she had experienced. Mrs. Tickit, though minutely circumstantial in her reply, had no settled opinion between 5 seconds and 10 minutes. She was so plainly at sea on this part of the case, and had so clearly been startled out of slumber, that Clennam was much disposed to regard the appearance as a dream. Without hurting Mrs. Tickit's feelings with that infidel solution of her mystery, he took it away from the cottage with him, and probably would have retained it ever afterwards if a circumstance had not soon happened to change his opinion. He was passing at nightfall along the Strand, and the lamplighter was going on before him, under whose hand the street lamps, blurred by the foggy air, burst out one after another, like so many blazing sunflowers coming into full blow all at once, when a stoppage on the pavement, caused by a train of coal wagons toiling up from the wharves at the riverside, brought him to a standstill. He had been walking quickly and going with some current of thought, and the sudden check given to both operations caused him to look freshly about him, as people under such circumstances usually do. Immediately, he saw in advance a few people intervening, but still so near to him that he could have touched them by stretching out his arm. Tattycoram and a strange man of a remarkable appearance, a swaggering man, with a high nose and a black moustache as false in its colour as his eyes were false in their expression, who wore his heavy cloak with the air of a foreigner. His dress and general appearance were those of a man on travel, and he seemed to have very recently joined the girl. In bending down, being much taller than she was, listening to whatever she said to him, he looked over his shoulder with the suspicious glance of one who was not unused to being mistrustful that his footsteps might be dogged. It was then that Clennam saw his face, as his eyes lowered on the people behind him in the aggregate, without particularly resting upon Clennam's face or any other. He had scarcely turned his head about again, and it was still bent down, listening to the girl, when the stoppage ceased and the obstructed stream of people flowed on. Still bending his head and listening to the girl, he went on at her side, and Clennam followed them, resolved to play this unexpected play out and see where they went. He had hardly made the determination, though he was not long about it, when he was again as suddenly brought up as he had been by the stoppage. They turned short into the Adelphi, the girl evidently leading, and went straight on as if they were going to the terrace which overhangs the river. There is always, to this day, a sudden pause in that place to the roar of the great thoroughfare. The many sounds become so deadened that the change is like putting cotton in the ears or having the head thickly muffled. At that time the contrast was far greater, there being no small steamboats on the river, no landing places but slippery wooden stairs and foot causeways, no railroad on the opposite bank, no hanging bridge or fish market near at hand, no traffic on the nearest bridge of stone, nothing moving on the stream but watermen's wherries and coal-lighters. Long and broad black tiers of the latter, moored fast in the mud as if they were never to move again, made the shore funeral and silent after dark, and kept what little water movement there was far out towards midstream. At any hour later than sunset, and not least at that hour when most of the people who have anything to eat at home are going home to eat it, and when most of those who have nothing have hardly yet slunk out to beg or steal, it was a deserted place and looked on a deserted scene. Such was the hour when Clennam stopped at the corner, observing the girl and the strange man as they went down the street. The man's footsteps were so noisy on the echoing stones that he was unwilling to add the sound of his own. But when they had passed the turning and were in the darkness of the dark corner leading to the terrace, he made after them with such indifferent appearance of being a casual passenger on his way as he could assume. When he rounded the dark corner, they were walking along the terrace towards a figure which was coming towards them. If he had seen it by itself, under such conditions of gas-lamp mist and distance, he might not have known it at first sight, but with the figure of the girl to prompt him, he at once recognized Miss Wade. He stopped at the corner, seeming to look back expectantly up the street as if he had made an appointment with someone to meet him there, but he kept a careful eye on the three. When they came together, the man took off his hat and made Miss Wade a bow. The girl appeared to say a few words as though she presented him, or accounted for his being late or early, or what not, and then fell a pace or so behind, by herself. Miss Wade and the man then began to walk up and down, the man having the appearance of being extremely courteous and complimentary in manner, Miss Wade having the appearance of being extremely haughty. When they came down to the corner and turned, she was saying, "If I pinch myself for it, sir, that is my business. Confine yourself to yours and ask me no question." "By heaven, ma'am," he replied, making her another bow, "it was my profound respect for the strength of your character and my admiration of your beauty." "I want neither the one nor the other from anyone," said she, "and certainly not from you of all creatures. Go on with your report." "Am I pardoned?" he asked, with an air of half-abashed gallantry. "You are paid," she said, "and that is all you want." Whether the girl hung behind because she was not to hear the business, or as already knowing enough about it, Clennam could not determine. They turned and she turned. She looked away at the river, and as she walked with her hands folded before her, and that was all he could make of her without showing his face. There happened, by good fortune, to be a lounger really waiting for someone, and he sometimes looked over the railing at the water, and sometimes came back to the dark corner and looked up the street, rendering Arthur less conspicuous. When Miss Wade and the man came back again, she was saying, "You must wait until tomorrow." "1,000 pardons," he returned. "My faith, then it's not convenient tonight?" "No. I tell you I must get it before I can give it to you." She stopped in the roadway as if to put an end to the conference. He, of course, stopped too, and the girl stopped. "It's a little inconvenient," said the man. "A little, but, holy blue, that's nothing in such a service. I am without money tonight by chance. I have a good banker in the city, but I would not wish to draw upon the house until the time when I shall draw for a round sum." "Harriet," said Miss Wade, "arrange with him, this gentleman here, for sending him some money tomorrow." She said it with a slur of the word gentleman, which was more contemptuous than any emphasis, and walked slowly on. The man bent his head again, and the girl spoke to him as they both followed her. Clennam ventured to look at the girl as they moved away. He could note that her rich black eyes were fastened upon the man with a scrutinizing expression, and that she kept a little distance from him as they walked side by side to the further end of the terrace. A loud and altered clank upon the pavement warned him, before he could discern what was passing there, that the man was coming back alone. Clennam lounged into the road towards the railing, and the man passed at a quick swing, with the end of his cloak thrown over his shoulder, singing a scrap of a French song. The whole vista had no one in it now but himself. The lounger had lounged out of view, and Miss Wade and Tattycoram were gone. More than ever bent on seeing what became of them, and on having some information to give his good friend Mr. Meagles, he went out at the further end of the terrace, looking cautiously about him. He rightly judged that, at first at all events, they would go in a contrary direction from their late companion. He soon saw them in a neighbouring by-street, which was not a thoroughfare, evidently allowing time for the man to get well out of their way. They walked leisurely, arm in arm, down one side of the street, and returned on the opposite side. When they came back to the street corner, they changed their pace for the pace of people with an object and a distance before them, and walked steadily away. Clennam, no less steadily, kept them in sight. They crossed the Strand, and passed through Covent Garden under the windows of his old lodging where dear little Dorrit had come that night, and slanted away north-east until they passed the great building whence Tattycoram derived her name, and turned into the Gray's Inn Road. Clennam was quite at home here, in right of Flora, not to mention the Patriarch and Panks, and kept them in view with ease. He was beginning to wonder where they might be going next, when that wonder was lost in the greater wonder with which he saw them turn into the patriarchal street. That wonder was in its turn swallowed up on the greater wonder with which he saw them stop at the patriarchal door. A low double knock at the bright brass knocker, a gleam of light into the road from the open door, a brief pause for inquiry and answer, and the door was shut, and they were housed. After looking at the surrounding objects for assurance that he was not in an odd dream, and after pacing a little while before the house, Arthur knocked at the door. It was opened by the usual maidservant, and she showed him up at once, with her usual alacrity, to Flora's sitting-room. There was no one with Flora but Mr. F.'s aunt, which respectable gentlewoman, basking in a balmy atmosphere of tea and toast, was ensconced in an easy chair by the fireside, with a little table at her elbow, and a clean white handkerchief spread over her lap, on which 2 pieces of toast at that moment awaited consumption. Bending over a steaming vessel of tea, and looking through the steam, and breathing forth the steam like a malignant Chinese enchantress, engaged in the performance of unholy rites, Mr. F.'s aunt put down her great teacup and exclaimed, "Drat, if he ain't come back again!" It would seem from the foregoing exclamation that this uncompromising relative of the lamented Mr. F. measuring time by the acuteness of her sensations, and not by the clock, supposed Clennam to have lately gone away, whereas at least a quarter of a year had elapsed since he had had the temerity to present himself before her. "My goodness, Arthur!" cried Flora, rising to give him a cordial reception. "Doyce and Clennam, what a start and a surprise, for though not far from the machinery and foundry business, and surely might be taken sometimes, if at no other time, about midday, when a glass of sherry and a humble sandwich of whatever cold meat in the larder might not come amiss, nor taste the worse for being friendly, for you know you buy it somewhere and wherever, brought a profit must be made, or they would never keep the place. It stands to reason without a motive still never seen and learnt now not to be expected. For as Mr. F. himself said, if seeing is believing, not seeing is believing too. When you don't see, you may fully believe you're not remembered. Not that I expect you, Arthur Doyce and Clennam, to remember me. Why should I, for the days are gone, but bring another teacup here directly, and tell her fresh toast, and pray sit near the fire?" Arthur was in the greatest anxiety to explain the object of his visit, but was put off for the moment, in spite of himself, by what he understood of the reproachful purport of these words, and by the genuine pleasure she testified in seeing him. "And now, pray tell me something, all you know," said Flora, drawing her chair near to his, "about the good, dear, quiet little girl, and all the changes of her fortunes, carriage, people now, no doubt, and horses without number, most romantic, a coat of arms, of course, and wild beasts on their hind legs, showing it as if it was a copy they had done with their mouths from ear to ear. Good gracious! And has she her health, which is the first consideration after all? What's his health without it? Mr. F. himself is so often saying, when his twinges came, that's sixpence a day, and find yourself, and no gout so much preferable. Not that he could have lived on anything like it, being the last man, or that the previous little thing, though far too familiar an expression now, had any tendency of that sort, much too slight and small, but looks so fragile, bless her." Mr. F.'s aunt, who had eaten a piece of toast down to the crust, here solemnly handed the crust to Flora, who ate it for her as a matter of business. Mr. F.'s aunt then moistened her 10 fingers in slow succession at her lips, and wiped them in exactly the same order on the white handkerchief, then took the other piece of toast and fell to work upon it. While pursuing this routine, she looked at Clennam with an expression of such intense severity that he felt obliged to look at her in return, against his personal inclinations. "She is in Italy with all her family, Flora," he said, when the dreaded lady was occupied again. "In Italy, is she really?" said Flora, "with the grapes growing everywhere, and lava necklaces and bracelets, too, that land of poetry, with burning mountains picturesque beyond belief, though if the organ boys come away from the neighbourhood not to be scorched, nobody can wonder, being so young, and bringing their white mice with them, most humane. And is she really in that favoured land, with nothing but blue about her, and dying gladiators and belvederes, though Mr. F. himself did not believe, for his objection when in his spirits was that the images could not be true, there being no medium between expensive quantities of linen badly got up, and all in creases, and none whatever, which certainly does not seem probable, though perhaps in consequence of the extremes of rich and poor, which may account for it." Arthur tried to edge a word in, but Flora hurried on again. "Venice preserved, too," said she. "I think you have been there. Is it well or ill preserved? The people differ so, and macaroni, if they really eat it like the conjurers, why not cut it shorter? You are acquainted, Arthur, dear Doyce and Clennam, at least not dear, and most assuredly not Doyce, for I have not the pleasure, but pray excuse me, acquainted, I believe, with Mantua. What has it got to do with Mantua making for? I never have been able to conceive." "I believe there is no connection, Flora, between the two," Arthur was beginning, when she caught him up again. "Upon your word, no, it isn't there. I never did, but that's like me. I run away with an idea, and having none to spare, I keep it. Alas, there was a time, dear Arthur, that is to say, decidedly not dear, not Arthur neither, but you understand me, when one bright idea glided the what's-his-name horizon of, etc., but it is darkly clouded now, and all is over." Arthur's increasing wish to speak of something very different was by this time so plainly written on his face that Flora stopped in a tender look and asked him what it was. "I have the greatest desire, Flora, to speak to someone who is now in this house. With Mr. Casby, no doubt. Someone whom I saw come in, and who, in a misguided and deplorable way, has deserted the house of a friend of mine." "Papa sees so many people, and such odd people," said Flora, rising, that I shouldn't venture to go down for any one but you, Arthur. But for you, I would willingly go down in a diving-bell, much more a dining-room, and will come back directly if you'll mind, and at the same time not mind Mr. F.'s aunt while I am gone." With those words and a parting glance, Flora bustled out, leaving Clennam under a dreadful apprehension of this terrible charge. The first variation which manifested itself in Mr. F.'s aunt's demeanour when she had finished her piece of toast was a loud and prolonged sniff. Finding it impossible to avoid construing this demonstration into a defiance of himself, its gloomy significance being unmistakable, Clennam looked plaintively at the excellent though prejudiced lady from whom it emanated, in the hope that she might be disarmed by a meek submission. "None of your eyes at me," said Mrs. F.'s aunt, shivering with hostility. "Take that." That was the crust of the piece of toast. Clennam accepted the boon with a look of gratitude, and held it in his hand under the pressure of a little embarrassment, which was not relieved when Mr. F.'s aunt, elevating her voice into a cry of considerable power, exclaimed, "He has a proud stomach, this chap. He's too proud a chap to eat it," and coming out of her chair, shook her venerable fist so very close to his nose as to tickle the surface. But for the timely return of Flora to find him in this difficult situation, further consequences might have ensued. Flora, without the least discomposure or surprise, but congratulating the old lady in an approving manner on being very lively tonight, handed her back to her chair. "He has a proud stomach, this chap," said Mr. F.'s relation on being reseated. "Give him a meal of chaff." "Oh, I don't think he would like that, aunt," returned Flora. "Give him a meal of chaff, I tell you," said Mr. F.'s aunt, glaring round Flora on her enemy. "It's the only thing for a proud stomach. Let him eat up every morsel. Drat him. Give him a meal of chaff." Under a general pretence of helping him to this refreshment, Flora got him out on the staircase. Mr. F.'s aunt, even then constantly reiterating with inexpressible bitterness that he was a chap and had a proud stomach, and over again insisting that equine provision being made for him which she had already so strongly prescribed. "Such an inconvenient staircase, and so many corner stairs, Arthur," whispered Flora. "Would you object to putting your arm round me under my pelerine?" With a sense of going downstairs in a highly ridiculous manner, Clennam descended in the required attitude, and only released his fair burden at the dining-room door. Indeed, even there she was rather difficult to be got rid of, remaining in his embrace to murmur, "Arthur, for mercy's sake, don't breathe it to Papa." She accompanied Arthur into the room, where the patriarch sat alone, with his list shoes on the fender, twirling his thumbs as if he had never left off. The youthful patriarch, aged 10, looked out of his picture frame above him with no calmer air than he. Both smooth heads were alike beaming, blundering, and bumpy. "Mr. Clennam, I am glad to see you. I hope you are well, sir. I hope you are well. Please to sit down. Please to sit down." "I had hoped, sir," said Clennam, doing so, and looking round with a face of blank disappointment, "not to find you alone." "Ah, indeed," said the patriarch sweetly. "Ah, indeed." "I told you so, you know, Papa," cried Flora. "Ah, to be sure," returned the patriarch. "Yes, just so. Ah, to be sure." "Pray, sir," demanded Clennam anxiously, "is Miss Wade gone?" "Miss? Oh, you call her Wade," returned Mr. Casby. "Highly proper." Arthur quickly returned, "What do you call her?" "Wade," said Mr. Casby. "Oh, always Wade." After looking at the philanthropic visage and the long silky white hair for a few seconds, during which Mr. Casby twirled his thumbs and smiled at the fire as if he were benevolently wishing it to burn him, that he might forgive it, Arthur began, "I beg your pardon, Mr. Casby." "Not so, not so," said the patriarch. "Not so." "But Miss Wade had an attendant with her, a young woman brought up by friends of mine, over whom her influence is not considered very salutary, and to whom I should be glad to have the opportunity of giving the assurance that she has not yet forfeited the interest of those protectors." "Really, really," returned the patriarch. Will you therefore be so good as to give me the address of Miss Wade?" "Dear, dear, dear," said the patriarch. "How very unfortunate. If you had only sent in to me when they were here. I observed a young woman, Mr. Clennam, a fine full-coloured young woman, Mr. Clennam, with very dark hair and very dark eyes, if I mistake not. Arthur assented, and said once more with new expression, "If you would be so good as to give me the address." "Dear, dear, dear," exclaimed the patriarch in sweet regret. "Tut, tut, tut. What a pity, what a pity. I have no address, sir. Miss Wade mostly lives abroad, Mr. Clennam. She has done so for some years, and she is, if I may say so of a fellow creature and a lady, fitful and uncertain to a fault, Mr. Clennam. I may not see her again for a long, long time. I may never see her again. What a pity, what a pity." Clennam saw now that he had as much hope of getting assistance out of the portrait as out of the patriarch, but he said nevertheless, "Mr. Casby, could you, for the satisfaction of the friends I have mentioned, and under any obligation of secrecy that you may consider it your duty to impose, give me any information at all touching Miss Wade? I have seen her abroad, and I have seen her at home, but I know nothing of her. Could you give me any account of her whatever?" "None," returned the patriarch, shaking his big head with his utmost benevolence. "None at all. Dear, dear, dear. What a real pity that she stayed so short a time and you delayed. As confidential agency business, I have occasionally paid this lady money, but what satisfaction is it to you, sir, to know that?" "Truly none at all," said Clennam. "Truly," assented the patriarch, with a shining face, as he philanthropically smiled at the fire. "None at all, sir. You hit the wise answer, Mr. Clennam. Truly none at all, sir." His turning of his smooth thumbs over one another as he sat there was so typical to Clennam of the way in which he would make the subject revolve if it were pursued, never showing any new part of it nor allowing it to make the smallest advance, that it did help much to convince him of his labour having been in vain. He might have taken any time to think about it, for Mr. Casby, well accustomed to get on anywhere by leaving everything to his bumps and his white hair, knew his strength to lie in silence. So there Casby sat, twirling and making his polished head and forehead look largely benevolent in every knob. With this spectacle before him, Arthur had risen to go, when from the inner dock where the good ship Banks was hove down when out in no cruising ground, the noise was heard of that steamer labouring towards him. It struck Arthur that the noise began demonstratively far off, as though Mr. Banks sought to impress on anyone who might happen to think about it that he was working on from out of hearing. Mr. Banks and he shook hands, and the former brought his employer a letter or two to sign. Mr. Banks, in shaking hands, merely scratched his eyebrow with his left forefinger and snorted once, but Clennam, who understood him better now than of old, comprehended that he had almost done for the evening and wished to say a word to him outside. Therefore, when he had taken his leave of Mr. Casby and, which was a more difficult process, of Flora, he sauntered in the neighbourhood on Mr. Banks's line of road. He had waited but a short time when Mr. Banks appeared. Mr. Banks, shaking hands again with another expressive snort and taking off his hat to put his hair up, Arthur thought he received his cue to speak to him as one who knew pretty well what had just now passed. Therefore he said, without any prejudice, "I suppose they really were gone, Banks?" "Yes," replied Banks, "they really were gone." "Does he know where to find that lady?" "Can't say. I shouldn't think so." Mr. Banks did not. No, Mr. Banks did not. Did Mr. Banks know anything about her? "I expect," rejoined that worthy, "I know as much about her as she knows about herself. She is somebody's child, anybody's, nobody's. Put her in a room in London here with any 6 people old enough to be her parents, and her parents might be there for anything she knows. There may be in any house she sees, there may be in any churchyard she passes, she may run against them in any street, she may make chance acquaintance of 'em at any time, and never know it. She knows nothing about 'em. She knows nothing about any relative whatever. Never did, never will. Mr. Casby could enlighten her, perhaps? "Maybe," said Panks. "I expect so, but don't know. Has long had money, not over much as I make out, in trust to dole out to her when she can't do without it. Sometimes she's proud and won't touch it for a length of time. Sometimes she's so poor that she must have it. She writhes under her life. A woman more angry, passionate, reckless, and revengeful never lived. She came for money tonight. Said she had peculiar occasion for it." "I think," observed Clennam, musing, "I by chance know what occasion. I mean, into whose pocket the money is to go." "Indeed," said Panks. "If it's a compact, I recommend that party to be exact in it. I wouldn't trust myself to that woman, young and handsome as she is, if I had wronged her. No, not for twice my proprietor's money, unless," Panks added, as a saving clause, "I had a lingering illness on me and wanted to get it over." Arthur, hurriedly reviewing his own observation of her, found it to tally pretty nearly with Mr. Panks's view. "The wonder is to me," pursued Panks, "that she has never done for my proprietor as the only person connected with her story she can lay hold of. Mentioning that, I may tell you, between ourselves, that I am sometimes tempted to do for him myself." Arthur started and said, "Dear me, Panks, don't say that." "Understand me," said Panks, extending 5 cropped coaly fingernails on Arthur's arm. "Oh, I don't mean cut his throat, but by all that's precious, if he goes too far, I'll cut his hair." Having exhibited himself in the new light of enunciating this tremendous threat, Mr. Panks, with a countenance of grave import, snorted several times and steamed away. Chapter 10. The dreams of Mrs. Flintwich thicken. The shady waiting rooms of the Circumlocution Office, where he passed a good deal of time in company with various troublesome convicts who were under sentence to be broken alive on that wheel, had afforded Arthur Clennam ample leisure in 3 or 4 successive days to exhaust the subject of his late glimpse of Miss Wade and Tattycoram. He had been able to make no more of it and no less of it, and in this unsatisfactory condition he was fain to leave it. During this space he had not been to his mother's dismal old house. One of his customary evenings for repairing thither now coming round, he left his dwelling and his partner at nearly 9 o'clock, and slowly walked in the direction of that grim home of his youth. It always affected his imagination as wrathful, mysterious, and sad, and his imagination was sufficiently impressible to see the whole neighbourhood under some tinge of its dark shadow. As he went along upon a dreary night, the dim streets by which he went seemed all depositories of oppressive secrets. The deserted counting-houses, with their secrets of books and papers locked up in chests and safes, and banking-houses, with their secrets of strong rooms and wells, the keys of which were in a very few secret pockets and a very few secret breasts, the secrets of all the dispersed grinders in the vast mill, among whom there were doubtless plunderers, forgers, and trust-betrayers of many sorts, whom the light of any day that dawned might reveal. He could have fancied that these things, in hiding, imparted a heaviness to the air. The shadow thickening and thickening as he approached its source, he thought of the secrets of the lonely church vaults, where the people who had hoarded and secreted in iron coffers were in their turn similarly hoarded, not yet at rest from doing harm, and then of the secrets of the river, as it rolled its turbid tide between 2 frowning wildernesses of secrets, extending thick and dense for many miles and warding off the free air and the free country swept by winds and wings of birds. The shadow still darkening as he drew near the house, the melancholy room which his father had once occupied, haunted by the appealing face he had himself seen fade away with him when there was no other watcher by the bed, arose before his mind. Its close air was secret. The gloom and must and dust of the whole tenement were secret. At the heart of it his mother presided, inflexible of face, indomitable of will, firmly holding all the secrets of her own and his father's life, and austerely opposing herself, front, to the great final secret of all life. He had turned into the narrow and steep street from which the court of enclosure wherein the house stood opened, when another footstep turned into it behind him, and so close upon his own that he was jostled to the wall. As his mind was teeming with these thoughts, the encounter took him altogether unprepared, so that the other passenger had had time to say boisterously, "Pardon, not my fault," and to pass on before the instant had elapsed which was requisite to his recovery of the realities about him. When that moment had flashed away, he saw that the man striding on before him was the man who had been so much in his mind during the last few days. It was no casual resemblance, helped out by the force of the impression the man made upon him. It was the man he had followed in company with the girl, and whom he had overheard talking to Miss Wade. The street was a sharp descent and was crooked too, and the man, who although not drunk had the air of being flushed with some strong drink, went down it so fast that Clennam lost him as he looked at him. With no defined intention of following him, but with an impulse to keep the figure in view a little longer, Clennam quickened his pace to pass the twist in the street which hid him from his sight. On turning it, he saw the man no more. Standing now close to the gateway of his mother's house, he looked down the street, but it was empty. There was no projecting shadow large enough to obscure the man. There was no turning near that he could have taken, nor had there been any audible sound of the opening and closing of a door. Nevertheless, he concluded that the man must have had a key in his hand and must have opened one of the many house doors and gone in. Ruminating on this strange chance and strange glimpse, he turned into the courtyard. As he looked, by mere habit, towards the feebly lighted windows of his mother's room, his eyes encountered the figure he had just lost, standing against the iron railings of the little waste enclosure, looking up at those windows and laughing to himself. Some of the many vagrant cats who were always prowling about there by night, and who had taken fright at him, appeared to have stopped when he had stopped, and were looking at him with eyes by no means unlike his own from tops of walls and porches and other safe points of pause. He had only halted for a moment to entertain himself thus. He immediately went forward, throwing the end of his cloak off his shoulder as he went, ascended the unevenly sunken steps, and knocked a sounding knock at the door. Clennam's surprise was not so absorbing, but that he took his resolution without any incertitude. He went up to the door too, and ascended the steps too. His friend looked at him with a braggart air, and sang to himself, "Who passes by this road so late, compagnon de la Majolaine, who passes by this road so late, always gay." After which he knocked again. "You are impatient, sir," said Arthur. "I am, sir. Death of my life, sir," returned the stranger. "It's my character to be impatient." The sound of Mistress Affery cautiously chaining the door before she opened it caused them both to look that way. Affery opened it a very little, with a flaring candle in her hands, and asked who was that, at that time of night, with that knock. "Why, Arthur," she added with astonishment, seeing him first. "Not you, sure?" "Oh, Lord save us, no!" she cried out, seeing the other. "Him again." "It's true, him again, dear Mrs. Flintwich," cried the stranger. "Open the door and let me take my dear friend Jeremiah to my arms. Open the door and let me hasten myself to embrace Mr. Flintwich." "He's not at home," cried Affery. "Fetch him," cried the stranger. "Fetch Mr. Flintwich. Tell him that it is his old blondois who comes from arriving in England. Tell him that it is his little boy who is here, his cabbage, his well-beloved. Open the door, beautiful Mrs. Flintwich, and in the meantime let me pass upstairs to present my compliments, homage au blondois, to my lady. My lady lives always. It is well." "Open, then." To Arthur's increased surprise, Mistress Affery, stretching her eyes wide at himself, as if in warning that this was not a gentleman for him to interfere with, drew back the chain and opened the door. The stranger, without ceremony, walked into the hall, leaving Arthur to follow him. "Dispatch, then, achieve, then, bring my Flintwich, announce me to my lady," cried the stranger, clanking about the stone floor. "Pray tell me, Affery," said Arthur aloud and sternly, as he surveyed from head to foot with indignation. "Who is this gentleman?" "Pray tell me, Affery," the stranger repeated in his turn. "Who, who is this gentleman?" The voice of Mrs. Clennam opportunely called from her chamber above. "Affery, let them both come up. Arthur, come straight to me." "Arthur!" exclaimed Blondois, taking off his hat at arm's length, and bringing his heels together from a great stride in making him a flourishing bow. "The son of my lady? I am the all-devoted of the son of my lady." Arthur looked at him again, in no more flattering a manner than before, and, turning on his heel without acknowledgment, went upstairs. The visitor followed him upstairs. Mistress Affery took the key from behind the door, and deftly slipped out to fetch her lord. A bystander, informed of the previous appearance of Monsieur Blondois in that room, would have observed a difference in Mrs. Clennam's present reception for him. Her face was not one to betray it, and her suppressed manner and her set voice were equally under her control. It wholly consisted in her never taking her eyes off his face from the moment of his entrance, and in her twice or thrice, when he was becoming noisy, swaying herself a very little forward in the chair, in which she sat upright, with her hands immovable upon its elbows, as if she gave him the assurance that he should be presently heard at any length he would. Arthur did not fail to observe this, though the difference between the present occasion and the former was not within his power of observation. "Madame," said Blondois, "do me the honour to present me to Monsieur your son. It appears to me, madame, that Monsieur your son is disposed to complain of me. He is not polite." "Sir," said Arthur, striking in expeditiously, "whoever you are, and however you come to be here, if I were the master of this house, I would lose no time in placing you on the outside of it." "But you are not," said his mother, without looking at him. "Unfortunately for the gratification of your unreasonable temper, you are not the master, Arthur." "I make no claim to be, mother. If I object to this person's manner of conducting himself here, and object to it so much that if I had any authority here I certainly would not suffer him to remain a minute, I object on your account." "In the case of objection being necessary," she returned, "I could object for myself, and of course I should." The subject of their dispute, who had seated himself, laughed aloud, and rapped his legs with his hand. "You have no right," said Mrs. Clennam, always intent on Blondois, however, directly she addressed her son, "to speak to the prejudice of any gentleman, least of all a gentleman from another country, because he does not conform to your standard, or square his behaviour by your rules. It is possible that the gentleman may, on similar grounds, object to you." "I hope so," returned Arthur. "The gentleman," pursued Mrs. Clennam, "on a former occasion brought a letter of recommendation to us from highly esteemed and responsible correspondents. I am perfectly unacquainted with the gentleman's object in coming here at present. I am entirely ignorant of it, and cannot be supposed likely to be able to form the remotest guess at its nature." Her habitual frown became stronger, as she very slowly and weightily emphasized those words. "But when the gentleman proceeds to explain his object, as I shall beg him to have the goodness to do to myself and Flintwich, when Flintwich returns, it will prove, no doubt, to be one more or less in the usual way of our business, which it will be both our business and our pleasure to advance. It can be nothing else." "We shall see, madame," said the man of business. "We shall see," she assented. "The gentleman is acquainted with Flintwich, and when the gentleman was in London last, I remember to have heard that he and Flintwich had some entertainment or good fellowship together. I am not in the way of knowing much that passes outside this room, and the jingle of little worldly things beyond it does not much interest me, but I remember to have heard that." "All right, madame, it is true." He laughed again, and whistled the burden of the tune he had sung at the door. "Therefore, Arthur," said his mother, "the gentleman comes here as an acquaintance and no stranger, and it is much to be regretted that your unreasonable temper should have found offence in him. I regret it. I say so to the gentleman. You will not say so, I know, therefore I say it for myself and Flintwich, since with us, too, the gentleman's business lies." The key of the door below was now heard in the lock, and the door was heard to open and close. In due sequence, Mr. Flintwich appeared, on whose entrance the visitor rose from his chair, laughing loud, and folded him in a close embrace. "How goes it, my cherished friend?" said he. "How goes the world, my Flintwich? Rose-coloured? So much the better, so much the better. Ah, but you look charming. Ah, but you look young and fresh as the flowers of spring. Ah, good little boy, brave child, brave child." While heaping these compliments on Mr. Flintwich, he rolled him about with a hand on each of his shoulders, until the staggerings of that gentleman, who, under the circumstances, was drier and more twisted than ever, were like those of a teetotum nearly spent. "I had a presentiment last time that we should be better and more intimately acquainted. Is it coming on you, Flintwich? Is it yet coming on?" "Why, no, sir," retorted Mr. Flintwich, "not unusually. Hadn't you better be seated? You have been calling for some more of that port, sir, I guess." "Ah, little joker, little pig," cried the visitor. "Ha, ha, ha, ha!" And throwing Mr. Flintwich away as a closing piece of raillery, he sat down again. The amazement, suspicion, resentment, and shame with which Arthur looked on at all this struck him dumb. Mr. Flintwich, who had spun backward some 2 or 3 yards under the impetus last given to him, brought himself up with a face completely unchanged in its stolidity except as it was affected by shortness of breath, and looked hard at Arthur. Not a whit less reticent and wooden was Mr. Flintwich outwardly than in the usual course of things, the only perceptible difference in him being that the knot of cravat, which was generally under his ear, had worked round to the back of his head, where it formed an ornamental appendage not unlike a bag-wig, and gave him something of a courtly appearance. As Mrs. Clennam never removed her eyes from Blondois, on whom they had some effect, as a steady look has on a lower sort of dog, so Jeremiah never removed his from Arthur. It was as if they had tacitly agreed to take their different provinces. Thus, in the ensuing silence, Jeremiah stood scraping his chin and looking at Arthur as though he were trying to screw his thoughts out of him with an instrument. After a little, the visitor, as if he felt the silence irksome, rose and impatiently put himself with his back to the sacred fire which had burned through so many years. Thereupon Mrs. Clennam said, moving one of her hands for the first time, and moving it very slightly with an action of dismissal, "Please leave us to our business, Arthur." "Mother, I do so with reluctance." "Never mind with what," she returned, "or with what not. Please to leave us. Come back at any other time when you may consider it a duty to bury half an hour wearily here. Good night." She held up her muffled fingers that he might touch them with his, according to their usual custom, and he stood over her wheeled chair to touch her face with his lips. He thought then that her cheek was more strained than usual, and that it was colder. As he followed the direction of her eyes in rising again towards Mr. Flintwich's good friend Mr. Blondois snapped his finger and thumb with one loud contemptuous snap. "I leave your business acquaintance in my mother's room, Mr. Flintwich," said Clennam, with a great deal of surprise and a great deal of unwillingness. The person referred to snapped his finger and thumb again. "Good night, mother." "Good night." "I had a friend once, my good comrade Flintwich," said Blondois, standing astride before the fire, and so evidently saying it to arrest Clennam's retreating steps that he lingered near the door. "I had a friend once who had heard so much of the dark side of this city and its ways, and he wouldn't have confided himself alone by night with 2 people who had an interest in getting him under the ground. My faith, not even in a respectable house like this, unless he was bodily too strong for them. Bah! What a poltroon, my Flintwich, eh?" "A cur, sir." "Agreed, a cur. But he wouldn't have done it, my Flintwich, unless he had known them to have the will to silence him without the power. He wouldn't have drunk from a glass of water under such circumstances, not even in a respectable house like this, my Flintwich, unless he had seen one of them drink first and swallow too. Disdaining to speak, and indeed not very well able, for he was half choking, Clennam only glanced at the visitor as he passed out. The visitor saluted him with another parting snap, and his nose came down over his moustache, and his moustache went up under his nose, in an ominous and ugly smile. "For heaven's sake, Affery," whispered Clennam, as she opened the door for him in the dark hall, and he groped his way to the sight of the night sky. "What is going on here?" Her own appearance was sufficiently ghastly, standing in the dark with her apron thrown over her head, and speaking behind it in a low, deadened voice. "Don't ask me anything, Arthur. I've been in a dream for ever so long. Go away." He went out, and she shut the door upon him. He looked up at the windows of his mother's room, and the dim light, deadened by the yellow blinds, seemed to say a response after Affery, and to mutter, "Don't ask me anything. Go away." Chapter 11. A Letter from Little Dorrit. Dear Mr. Clennam, as I said in my last, that it was best for nobody to write to me, and as my sending you another little letter can therefore give you no other trouble than the trouble of reading it, perhaps you may not find leisure for even that, though I hope you will some day. I am now going to devote an hour to writing to you again. This time I write from Rome. We left Venice before Mr. and Mrs. Gowan did, but they were not so long upon the road as we were, and did not travel by the same way, and so when we arrived we found them in a lodging here, in a place called the Via Gregoriana. I dare say you know it. Now, I am going to tell you all I can about them, because I know that it is what you most want to hear. Theirs is not a very comfortable lodging, but perhaps I thought it less so when I first saw it than you would have done, because you have been in many different countries and have seen many different customs. Of course, it is a far, far better place, millions of times, than any I have ever been used to until lately, and I fancy I don't look at it with my own eyes, but with hers. For it would be easy to see that she has always been brought up in a tender and happy home, even if she had not told me so with great love for it. Well, it is a rather bare lodging, up a rather dark common staircase, and it is nearly all a large dull room where Mr. Gowan paints. The windows are blocked up where anyone could look out, and the walls have been all drawn over with chalk and charcoal by others who have lived there before, I should think for years. There is a curtain more dust-coloured than red, which divides it, and the part behind the curtain makes the private sitting-room. When I first saw her there, she was alone, and her work had fallen out of her hand, and she was looking up at the sky shining through the tops of the windows. Pray, do not be uneasy when I tell you, but it was not quite so airy, nor so bright, nor so cheerful, nor so happy and youthful altogether as I should have liked it to be. On account of Mr. Gowan's painting Papa's picture, which I am not quite convinced I should have known from the likeness if I had not seen him doing it, I have had more opportunities of being with her since then than I might have had without this fortunate chance. She is very much alone indeed. Shall I tell you about the second time I saw her? I went one day when it happened that I could run round by myself at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She was then dining alone, and her solitary dinner had been brought in from somewhere over a kind of brazier with a fire in it, and she had no company or prospect of company that I could see, but the old man who had brought it. He was telling her a long story of robbers outside the walls being taken up by a stone statue of a saint, to entertain her, as he said to me when I came out, because he had a daughter of his own, though she was not so pretty. I ought now to mention Mr. Gowan before I say what little more I have to say about her. He must admire her beauty, and he must be proud of her, for everybody praises it, and he must be fond of her, and I do not doubt that he is, but in his way. You know his way, and if it appears as careless and discontented in your eyes as it does in mine, I am not wrong in thinking that it might be better suited to her. If it does not seem so to you, I am quite sure I am wholly mistaken, for your unchanged poor child confides in your knowledge and goodness more than she could ever tell you if she was to try. But don't be frightened. I am not going to try. Owing, as I think, if you think so too, to Mr. Gowan's unsettled and dissatisfied way, he applies himself to his profession very little. He does nothing steadily or patiently, but equally takes things up and throws them down and does them or leaves them undone without caring about them. When I have heard him talking to Papa during the sittings for the picture, I have sat wondering whether it could be that he has no belief in anybody else, because he has no belief in himself. Is it so? I wonder what you will say when you come to this. I know how you will look, and I can almost hear the voice in which you would tell me on the iron bridge. Mr. Gowan goes out a good deal among what is considered the best company here, though he does not look as if he enjoyed it or liked it when he is with it, and she sometimes accompanies him, but lately she has gone out very little. I think I have noticed that they have an inconsistent way of speaking about her, as if she had made some great self-interested success in marrying Mr.